He bathed a 2,000-year-old alien beast. What happened next was beautiful. Sarlon had not been touched in 2,000 years, not since the burning of Zareth when he reduced 9 fleets to cinders and crowned Emperor Vardax with molten vengeance. Since, that day, he had been both throne and threat, chained beneath the palace in a tomb of soot and silence, his presence the Empire's most dreaded symbol of dominion. No servant was allowed within 20 paces. No scholar had dared study him. Even the priests of Bloodfire spoke his name only in tremors. Time had not dulled his fury. It had only thickened it, caked it like black mud across his ivory-scaled frame. His wings, once fanned across the stars like solar sails, now hung in filth-crusted tatters. His claws scraped the obsidian floor restlessly, never fully sleeping, never fully awake. Sarlon was war-waiting. Emperor Vardax liked it that way. He believed a beast unwashed was a beast unsoftened. Let him stink of conquest. Let his breath reek of ancient fire and forgotten slaughter. Cleanliness was for comfort. Vardax did not want comfort. He wanted fear, pure, unrelenting, and ever-present. Sarkhalon was his sword beneath the floor, his unspoken decree. Disobey, and the dragon will remember your name. But the dragon hadn't been bathed since before most of the Empire. Systems had even been discovered. Dirt caked the spaces between his scales. Dried blood from a dozen empires crusted his teeth. His eyes, once twin beacons of primal heat, had grown heavy, dulled with neglect. Even beasts forged from cosmic flame could grow weary. Then came Halbranic. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't even military. He was a foreman from the Orion salvage yard, sent under contract to help restore water flow through the lower palace systems. Leaky piping, pressure inconsistencies, corroded valves. His file said nothing about valor. His uniform had grease stains older than most bureaucrats. His voice, low and clipped, belonged to a man who dealt in problems, not politics. When Hal found the pipeline kinked just outside a blast-sealed chamber marked with ancient sigils, he sighed, rubbed his neck, and requested clearance. The clearance came too quickly. The guards barely looked up as he passed, wheeling in a pressurized wash tank, a hose rigged from spare parts, and a bottle of soap concentrate so potent it was labeled, "Not for use on anything living." He stepped through the vault doors alone. Steam rose around him, thick with sulfur and decay. The room stank of scorched air, rusted iron, and something deeper, memory. A low breath filled the space like a rising tide. Something huge stirred in the darkness. 2 eyes opened. They glowed faintly. Hal stopped 5 paces in. He looked at the beast, the legend, the skeletal shadow of empire covered in centuries of grime, and said flatly, "Well, you look like hell." The dragon blinked once. No roar. No flame. Just silence. Hal raised the hose. "I'm not asking permission." The hiss of water echoed like heresy. The pressure burst forward from the hose, striking Saren's left shoulder where dust had turned to stone. The dragon twitched, not in rage but in surprise. Hal braced his boots against the slick floor and adjusted the dial, letting the temperature rise slowly, methodically. He moved like someone washing a vehicle older than regulation. Steady arcs. No wasted motion, no difference. He scrubbed the exposed joints behind Sarlon's foreleg, working the filth loose with a heavy bristled brush. Grime cracked, flaked away like armor molting from old flesh. A low rumble vibrated the walls. It wasn't a growl. It was something else, a sound of confusion, of long-forgotten sensation. Hal didn't flinch, he just kept working. He dipped the brush into a bucket of suds mixed from old cargo soap and potassium extract and muttered, "You ever hear of lubrication maintenance? Because whatever's stuck in here isn't battle-earned, it's just lazy upkeep." Sarlon shifted, lifting, one claw, then slowly set it down. He didn't try to bite, didn't raise his wings. His tail coiled once behind him, dragging dust. A second rumble followed, deeper, softer. Hal raised an eyebrow. "You purring?" No answer, only heat and the slow blink of gold-ringed eyes watching him work. He climbed a scaffold next, hosing down the arch of the dragon's wing joint. watching centuries of grit sluice down into the drains like old sins. He used a sander, pad on one armored rib, tapping it gently like coaxing breath from a giant bell. Sarkhalon's head swiveled, his eyes narrowing not in warning, but in study. He was trying to remember this, not the process, but the feeling. The last time hands had touched him without fear, without weapon, without command. Above, through surveillance feeds, Emperor Vardax watched from his sky throne, wine forgotten, in his hand, his eyes wide. "What is he doing?" Vardax whispered. "Bathing the dragon, sire," replied the steward, his voice dry. "Why isn't Saralon eating him?" The steward hesitated. "Because he doesn't want to." The emperor stood, robes falling heavy around him. Below, Hal sprayed under the dragon's chin, rinsing away sediment older than some planets. A film of oily black washed down the slope of Saralon's chest and revealed faintly the shimmer of polished platinum beneath. Hal stepped back. "Well," he muttered, arms crossed. "Would you look at that? You were meant to shine." Sarlon let out a slow breath, and for the first time in 2,000 years, the dragon lowered his head and closed his eyes. Emperor Vardax did not blink as the surveillance feed panned across Saralon's chamber, where the unimaginable was unfolding in real time. A dragon bred for genocide, a living relic of conquest, was allowing a human foreman to scrub behind his ears. The scene offended everything Vardax had built his empire upon. Sarkhalon was terror incarnate, a beast of ash and annihilation. He was not a creature to be touched, let alone rinsed and brushed like a common stable lizard. Yet there he was, tail curled, breath steady, body still, surrendering to the quiet rhythm of soap and water. The emperor descended. He gave no speech. He issued no commands. He simply stood and moved, robes trailing behind him like the shadow of a fallen star, his silent guards keeping pace without a word. The lift to the deep vaults had not been used in decades. None dared breach the gates beneath his throne. None but Hal Brannock, the man too stubborn to fear. When the vault doors opened for Vardak, heat rolled into his bones. He stepped into the chamber alone. The air smelled of steam, minerals, and, strangely, citrus soap. The hiss of the hose echoed faintly from the far end of the room. He followed the sound, and then he saw it. Hal stood on a reinforced scaffold, gently brushing the space between Saralon's dorsal plates where grime and burnt marrow had formed thick calluses. The dragon made no sound of protest. He simply shifted, to give the human better access. A creature that had incinerated fleets was now leaning into the pressure of a scrubbing pad like a cat beneath the sun. The emperor stopped. He stared. His breath caught in his throat. Sarlon saw him and did not move. Not to rise, not to bow, not to bare his fangs. He simply blinked and then looked away, as if Vardax no longer mattered. "What?" the emperor whispered. "Have you done to him?" Hal didn't look down. "Cleaned him." Vardax took another step forward. "He hasn't allowed anyone near him in millennia." "Because no one ever asked what he needed," Hal said, rinsing one of the spinal ridges with slow, precise pressure. "You fed him commands, not care. You made him a weapon, not a creature. He is not a creature. He is mine." "No, he isn't," Hal replied. "Not anymore." Silence fell, and then Sarlon did the unthinkable. He lowered his massive head toward the emperor, not in threat, not in warning, but in passive acknowledgement. His tail swished and his massive body shifted slightly to curl around Hal as if guarding him. The emperor's knees almost gave. He stepped back, jaw clenched, eyes blazing. "I created you," he growled to the dragon. "You swore your fire to me." Sarlon opened one eye and exhaled, and in that breath there was no loyalty, only fatigue, only freedom, only a wordless, ancient truth, that sometimes fire remains not out of obedience but because it has never known water. The moment rippled through the empire like a quake across glass. By the time Emperor Vardax returned to his throne, pale and silent, the palace rumor engines had already begun. Footage of Hal gently washing Saren's snout spread through the undernets like wildfire. No one could believe it. People thought it was doctored, others wept. Some, those who had suffered beneath the symbol of the beast, simply stared, unable to process what it meant. In the days that followed, Sarlin changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but visibly. He began to pace less. He began to sleep more. And when Hal arrived each morning with his oversized pressure hose and makeshift saddle pail full of cleaning supplies, the dragon would greet him not with fire, but with a slow rumbling sound no one had heard in 2,000 years. A purr. At first, Hal spoke little during their sessions. He worked in silence, rhythmically washing away centuries of soot, blood, and bone, dust until each day the dragon gleamed a little brighter. The ritual became more than maintenance. It became medicine. The way Saralon's breathing eased, the way his spine finally unfurled, the way he stopped snapping in his sleep. On the 7th day, Hal brought a bucket of boiled fish mixed with synth herbs. He didn't toss it. He offered it. Sarlin sniffed, then opened his jaws and let Hal hand-feed him every bite. The guards watching nearly collapsed. And above, in the quiet shadows of the palace tower, Vardax watched and watched and watched, not with fury but with confusion. He summoned Hal again. This time the foreman arrived not in uniform but in simple, clean overalls, carrying a damp towel over his shoulder and a container of wing balm. "You have done something dangerous," the Emperor said. "You've made a monster forget its purpose." "No," Hal said. "I reminded him he had one before you rewrote it." "You could topple everything." "Maybe," Hal answered. "Or maybe this is what you should have done when you first put him in chains." Vardax leaned forward, eyes unreadable. "Why do you care?" And Hal's answer was simple. Because no one else ever did. When Hal left that evening, Sarlin followed him all the way to the inner gate, his talons tapping softly against the old stone. He stopped before crossing the threshold and looked back as if wondering how much more of the palace he could shed, how much of the old fear could be rinsed from the bones of his body. Hal patted his snout. "Tomorrow we do your wings," he said. And the dragon, silent as nightfall, lowered his head in agreement. The 8th day began like the 7 before it, steam hissing in the depths beneath the throne, Hal Brannock whistling softly as he wheeled in his soap bucket cart. But above, in the marble halls of the upper citadel, the Empire held its breath. Something had shifted, not just within the beast, but within the bones of every man, woman, and child who had ever looked to the palace for fear or shelter. Sarlon was still dangerous. That hadn't changed, but danger no longer defined him. Across the capital, images of the dragon's silvery scales, now polished, gleaming, alive, were broadcast across every terminal, every relay tower, every whispered corridor. Of the nobility, the symbol of terror had become something else, not domesticated, not tamed, respected. Some wept, others rioted. Many simply didn't know what to do with the strange hope curling beneath their ribs. At the base of the palace, Hal reached for the heavy oil balm reserved for Saralon's wings. The dragon lay sprawled across the thermal stone, wings half extended, eyes half lidded in the pleasure of stillness. For the first time in generations, the great beast didn't twitch at echoes, didn't growl at footfalls. He only watched Hal, steady and curious, as if trying to understand why this man's hands were the first in 2 millennia that didn't shake when they touched him. "You've got a scar here," Hal murmured, gently lifting the edge of the beast's left wing where a burn the size of a crater marred the membrane. "Old one. Went deep." Saralin let out a long, low breath. Not a complaint, a memory. "Bet they never looked at it," Hal continued. "Bet they just told you to fly harder." The dragon didn't speak. Couldn't perhaps, but the air around them felt denser, more aware. Hal pressed the balm gently into the scar, working it slow, working it true. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He simply stayed. Above them, the Emperor was not watching through screens this time. He stood in person at the edge of the vault stairs, arms folded, face unreadable, robes whipping in the warm exhaust wind rising from the dragon's chamber. Saralon noticed him. He raised his head, but unlike the hundreds of times before when he bared fangs or hissed flame or roared dominance, this time the dragon simply looked at him and waited, as if offering something. Vardak stepped down slowly until he reached the edge of the platform. Hal looked up once, then kept working. The Emperor said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, he spoke. I was only 16 when he burned the moons of Velimir for my coronation. Hal wiped his hands clean. Yeah, that a thing he wanted to do? Vardak's face twitched. I never asked. Sarlin's tail flicked once, not as a warning, more like punctuation. Vardax looked at the beast, saw the clean silver of his scales, the polished gleam of his horns, the slow, patient intelligence in those molten eyes. He swallowed and said, I didn't know he could look like that. Hal folded his arms. He always could. The Emperor hesitated. I made him into a monster. No, Hal said gently. You just treated him like one long enough that he stopped remembering what he was. There was silence then, not heavy, but sacred. Then Saralon did something that hadn't happened in any living memory. He uncurled. He stood. He stretched his wings. Clean, vast, magnificent, sending wind through the chamber like a prayer. He rose up slowly, towering and full, not crouched, not chained. His neck curled down toward Vardex, and he bowed, not in obedience but in forgiveness. It happened during the 9th cleansing, a symbolic ceremony the Empire held every year to mark the purging of treason. It was a cold ritual, names read, effigies burned, titles revoked. Saralon had never participated. His role was to watch, to loom behind the throne, flame ready for execution if needed. But this year, Saralon was missing. The crowd murmured. Priests looked nervously to the sky. The Emperor stood tall, regalia perfect, but his jaw clenched with unease. Then the wind shifted, and the shadow came. Saralon emerged from the western sky like a comet, wings wide, silver glinting in the sun, carrying Hal Brannock on a custom-forged saddle plate bolted into the ridge of his spine. The people didn't scream. They gasped, as if watching a star rewrite itself mid-burn. Sarlin landed in the center of the plaza. He didn't snarl. He didn't breathe fire. He simply stood, still, immense, majestic. Hal dismounted with practiced ease. Vardak stepped forward. The air shimmered. The crowd braced for conflict, for insult, for spectacle. But instead the Emperor dropped to one knee, not before Hal but before the dragon. I was wrong, he said. I am sorry. And Saralon, in answer, leaned forward and pressed his massive brow against Vardax's chest. A moment. A breath. And then the city erupted in applause. Not choreographed, not commanded. Real. The dragon who had once burned worlds was now honored as guardian. The foreman who had given him a bath now rode him like kin. The Emperor who had ruled by fear now knelt with humility. Later in the great square, someone carved a monument. Not of a weapon, not of a chain, but of a man lifting a hose and a beast, lowering his head in peace, and beneath it etched in stone, what fear could not command, kindness quietly reclaimed. Saralon's flight across the skies of Sidra Prime was seen by over 12 billion beings in real time. News feeds struggled to interpret what had just occurred. The once feared dragon, long used as a symbol of imperial annihilation, had appeared not as a weapon but as a presence. The plaza had not burned. No lives were taken. Instead there had been silence, and a bow, and the most powerful man in the known systems kneeling in return. The ripple effect was immediate. Across the border worlds, rebels paused their marches, unsure if the throne was crumbling or evolving. On Nus, a planet once seared by Saralon's breath, crowds gathered beneath broken monuments to watch the footage loop endlessly. Children touched statues they once feared. Elders wept, not in grief but disbelief. The warlords of the outlying dominions did not weep. They met in shadowed vaults and furious war councils, interpreting the dragon's transformation as a weakness. A bath and a human pet, snarled Varn of Kreller. and the monster who once turned suns red now plays nursemaid. They began drafting plans, sowing discontent, readying fleets. But they underestimated one thing. The dragon wasn't playing, and neither was Hal Brannock. The palace grew quieter in the days after the cleansing, not somber, centered. Saran now roamed freely within the royal quarter, often seen perched atop. The solar spire's wings stretched toward the light. The guards no longer stood ready to shoot. They fed him, spoke to him, even laughed, cautiously, reverently. Hal, meanwhile, was given quarters near the Emperor's own, though he insisted on sleeping in his old bunk near the maintenance deck, muttering, "Them fancy sheets make me itch." The engineers adored him. The nobles weren't sure what to do with him. And the Emperor began visiting more often. Vardax no longer spoke from behind robes and ceremony. He came in plain attire, sometimes silent, sometimes curious, and more than once he simply sat and watched as Hal cleaned the last remaining crevices of Saralon's frame, places missed, scars hidden, aches never soothed. "You treat him like a friend," Vardax murmured once. Hal paused, wiping his hands. "No," he said. "I treat him like a being who's never been treated like one." "You could have claimed anything," Vardax added. "Power, rank, command." Hal shrugged. "I already have something rarer." The Emperor tilted his head. "Which is?" Hal looked toward Saralon, who lay curled, eyes closed, a low vibration of contentment humming in his chest. "Trust." But trust, as always, would be tested. A week later, a transmission reached the palace gates, encrypted. Old world code shattered across 30 layers. It came from the gray wastes, deep in dead space, a planet called Trenar. The message was simple. The brother of the beast sleeps in chains. He remembers nothing, but his eyes burn still. Vardax ordered the file sealed. Hal read it anyway, and Saralon, upon hearing the name, rose. No growl, no flame. But his body shook, his wings extended, and the fire behind his eyes reignited. He remembered. And he knew what Trenar meant. A call, a cry, a sibling, another dragon, still forgotten. The journey to Trankor was not authorized. Vardax forbade it. His advisors raged. Even Sarlin hesitated, but only for a moment, because something in that name awakened memory locked in marrow. Trenar had been a fortress world long before Vardax's empire rose. It was where the dragon species, Saran's kind, had been cold harvested, corrupted. The last time he'd heard the name, his wings were smaller, his mind was wild. He'd had a brother, then younger, golden, full of laughter. They had tried to escape. Only one of them had made it. Now, centuries later, the call had come. And Hal didn't hesitate. He packed nothing. He brought only a satchel of tools, a thermal pressure canister, and his wash gear. Vardax confronted him before departure. "You don't understand what you're waking," he said. "I didn't understand Sarlon either," Hal replied, "until I gave him a chance. This won't end with soap and kindness." "No," Hal agreed. "But it might begin with them." The shuttle they took was small, fast, silent. Sarlon flew beside it, his body a streak of silver cutting through nebula dust, silent and colossal. He did not speak, but Hal could feel the tension rippling beneath each wing beat, the gravity of what was coming. When they reached Trankor, the surface was scorched, lifeless, but humming with buried heat. Beneath the crust, sensors detected movement, a chamber, a pulse, and a heartbeat. The descent was slow, dark, heavy. Hal entered first, climbing through collapsed blast doors into a subterranean chamber carved of old war metal and fireglass. Chains lined the walls, symbols long outlawed whispered old magic, and in the center a shape, huge, curled, scarred, breathing. Another dragon, not as large as Saralon but close. His body trembled in sleep. His eyes glowed like cracked lightning. Sarlon entered behind Hal. He stopped. The golden beast stirred, then opened his eyes and roared. The scream was ancient, broken, full of rage. Flame erupted from his jaws. But Hal didn't run. He stepped forward, raised both hands, and said, "It's okay. I came to clean you too." And Sarlin stepped between them, not to strike, but to kneel. The golden dragon froze, then sniffed and blinked. Recognition bloomed. He remembered his brother, the one who left, the one who survived. The chains didn't break that day by force. They fell when the two dragons curled their necks together, and Hal reached out, holding soap in one hand and a name the galaxy had forgotten in the other. The moment Hal Brannich's hand touched the golden dragon's scorched hide, something deeper than memory stirred. It wasn't just recognition. It was ache. A pain older than language. A raw, buried scream that had learned to live in silence. Saralon stood motionless behind him, wings half-folded, eyes locked on his brother. The two beasts, silver and gold, had once been stars together, twin thunder across the sky. But here, beneath the crushed bones of Trenar, they had been reduced to history. And something worse. Separation. The Golden One didn't lash out. He didn't breathe flame. He only watched as Hal worked. Gentle, steady, with the same battered brush and pressure hose he'd used 100 times before. "Let's start here," Hal said softly, rubbing a balm into the blackened creases behind one joint. "They tied you tight. You've been stuck so long I bet you forgot your shape." The dragon flinched, not in pain, but in recognition. Hal worked in silence, scraping dried ash from the grooves along the beast's throat. The golden dragon's name had long since vanished from records, but Saralon called him something. One word breathed like smoke across molten stone. "Rave." Hal said it out loud once. The golden dragon blinked, then lowered his head. The first time Hal rinsed the scales beneath Ra's left wing, he found marks, branding sigils burned deep, symbols of experiments, extraction, agony. He didn't ask what they were. He just said, "You didn't deserve this," and kept washing. Sarlin sat in silence, tail wrapped, unmoving, like a statue waiting for the sky to apologize. The Empire's sensors lit up that night. Vardax saw the alerts. Unauthorized dragon signature, planet Trenar, heat readings off the charts. He ignored the protests of his council, stood alone, and whispered into the command line. Let them finish. Because he knew something sacred was unfolding. Back on Trenar, Rave made no sound, but he didn't stop Hal either. On the 4th hour, he extended a claw, slowly placing it beside Saron's. Then, like a memory blooming in silence, he leaned his head into Hal's hands and wept. Not in tears, but in heatless smoke, coiling from his nostrils like morning turned into steam. When the twin dragons rose from the depths of Trenar, the stars paused. Sarlon gleaming silver again. Rave reborn in streaks of gold, his body no longer curled in chains, but stretched wide in clean light, their wings unfolded together, spanning the cratered world like a pair of fallen gods remembering how to fly. Hal stood between them. His arms were crossed. His face was blackened with soot and steam, a smear of blood running down one brow. But his eyes shone. He didn't need to speak because they were watching. From the edges of the Empire, from the hollow moons and broadcast satellites and the old rebel sectors. Everyone was watching. The footage beamed through the system relays without. Encryption. The dragons rose together, not as weapons, not as war, but as choice. Rave tilted his head skyward. Hal nodded once, and then the two of them launched into the air with an explosion of thunder that cracked open the clouds. They didn't fly in attack formation. They flew in synchrony, over the mining belts of Solari, over the orphan towers of Garanth, over the refugee sky bridges of Trenos, where children pointed to the sky and cheered. And Hal, riding in the custom rig mounted between Saralon's shoulders, grinned through the wind. "First time flying in 2,000 years, he called out. "How's it feel?" Saralon didn't answer with words. He just roared. And it was not the roar of fear. It was freedom. Rave answered, his voice louder, wilder, joyous. The two of them spun in the clouds, twining together like comets, flame trailing not as fire, but as light. When they finally landed on Kra Prime again, the Emperor waited, in silence. His guards remained back. He stood alone. Hal climbed down first, hands blistered, clothes torn, eyes tired. Rave landed second. No one dared approach. The Golden Dragon looked around at the city that had once sent fleets to kill him. He didn't breathe fire. He didn't roar. He simply lowered his head. The Emperor walked forward, slow, careful. Then he bowed to both dragons, not a theatrical gesture, not for optics, but in humility. "You were wronged," he said, "and I let it happen." Rave blinked once, then stepped forward and curled around Saralon's side like a brother returning home from a war no one remembered starting. Hal walked past Vardax, slapping his shoulder gently. "You know," he said, "might be time to update the throne room decor." Vardax raised a brow. "To what?" Hal smirked. "2 dragons, 1 mechanic, no chains." Later that night, across every system, the Empire declared a new holiday. Day of Washing, in honor of the mechanic who bathed a forgotten beast, in memory of the scars we choose to heal, and in celebration of the dragons who at last had learned to fly not in service of fear, but in the name of freedom.